We have a special guest lecturer to share some knowledge with us. His name is Dr. Alan Rosen. He comes to us from Jerusalem. He's a former student of Professor Elie Wiesel, and he is a specialist in Holocaust literature. He's going to speak to us today for about 35 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. If you're around the side of the room, let me know. I can come and help you. Today, the lecture is entitled Celebrating Fervor in the Wake of the Holocaust. Elie Wiesel is Chasid and Chronicler of the Chasidic Legacy. And please welcome him. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks so much to Professor Anderson and for Professor Rosen, who known for years, so it's great to have a reunion here in this beautiful room with all these beautiful faces here too, and to have the prospect of studying together in 2 sessions of in the midst of your class. Let me start with a story that should be familiar to you, meaning that I've been told you were assigned to read Professor Wiesel's Souls on Fire. And as you know, that Souls on Fire then is organized according to different Chasidic masters, moving chronologically. And in the section on the Maggid of Mezrich, Rabbi Dov Ber of Mezrich, who is the successor to the founder of the Chasidic movement, the story that Professor Wiesel starts with goes as follows. Famous story, but I think important that he begins with that. The Maggid of Mezrich, Rabbi Dov Ber, was not a rabbi when he was 5 years old when this story takes place. And unfortunately, his house where he and his family were living caught on fire. And he and his mother then, thank God, safely got out of the house. And they're standing and watching as the fire is consuming their house. And the boy, Dov Ber, looks over and he sees his mother sobbing. And in a way, that would seem natural. One's house is going up in flames, yeah. But the spiritual level that clearly was the home that this boy came from, was such that he knew his mother was not attached to material possessions. And that's one of the leitmotifs of the Chasidic movement. And so he was bewildered. So he turned to his mother. He says, "Mother, this is, look, yeah, the house is going up in flames, but here we're safe. And here you are crying. Why? Over such a thing, wood, mortar. I mean, it's stuff. It's stuff of this world. Why would you be crying?" So she says, "I'm not crying about the house. I'm crying about what was lost inside the house." He says, "What, furniture? This is what you're crying about?" "No, it's not furniture." "So what?" "It's a book that we have in our family that traces our lineage, our family history, back to King David. Which is not so, despite the length of time, there are a number of great sages that know their history dating back, and so it was with his family. And the book showed every generation and who and where and how their family was connected. And that's gone up in flames, says his mother. So the young boy, Dov Ber, says to his mother with much sobriety, "Mother, don't cry." He said, "I'll start a new lineage and a new book." And that's what Professor Wiesel brings down, what he starts the section of the Maggid. And I think, first of all, that it's a powerful story because just in its own right, the lineage of this boy is truly one of the great lines of Hasidic masters that continues to very much flourish in the world today, in a number of different Chasidic courts, including one that I was recently had the privilege of being at called Bian, not far from where I live in Jerusalem. Second, though, more to our purposes, and for really the question that Professor Anderson asked me to address in this context, was what's the connection of Professor Wiesel's commitment to tracing the lines of Hasidism in the wake of the Holocaust? Why should someone who's the preeminent spokesperson about the Holocaust and whose writing, which we're going to see virtually up to this time, almost comprehensively dealt with the Holocaust, why should he veer off course, we can say, and devote himself to a book on Hasidism? And make that not only a book, but rather one of the fundamental dimensions of his life's work, his life more generally. So that's a question, I think, just to refine it a bit, that we know that someone of Professor Wiesel's stature, and certainly by this time, in the early 1970s, that he was so clearly the one who set out the vocabulary by which the world would speak about the Holocaust. So it wasn't like Professor Grodin, a distinguished scholar, and someone who can work in different fields because he has at his command these different fields to address. But Professor Wiesel was known. There was a world waiting to hear what he was going to say next about the Holocaust. And here he is then writing a book on Hasidism. So that's our question. How does this book, how does this project, which is a number of books, take further the cause of Holocaust and genocide education in the aftermath? So with that introduction, I see we have at least one of the sheets. Do we have the other bibliography there? Do you have that to refer to? Yeah, great. Now, this is, first of all, important because it's just important to know, have a full purview of Professor Wiesel's work. And the way that we were asked in this article to divide up the writings, I believe I was requested to organize in this way, maybe it was some of my doing, was by genres. And we see then that there are many different genres that Elie Wiesel has written in, as you probably know: memoirs, novels, lyrics, collections of essays, collaborative works, children's writing. And then there's a list of secondary works. This is from 2003, so it's somewhat dated, but I hope still has some merit. But when we turn to collection of essays, one striking thing, the first point of the four and a half points that I want to make before we open the discussion, is that Elie Wiesel has written, as part of his oeuvre, 4 or 5 books actually, titled Celebration. We remember that he writes most of the time in French, which became in the 1950s his literary language after he first wrote his memoir Night in Yiddish. He then, once he started writing novels and literary essays, switched primarily to French while continuing on the side to write in Yiddish and in Hebrew. Never virtually in English, interestingly, even when he became, and still is, eloquent in English. So 4 or 5 books titled Celebration, and that was really in a project that schemed 7 books on all facets of Jewish life that would go by the title Celebration. And when we look down here, the 3rd entry we see is the first one, Celebration Chasidic, meaning Chasidic celebration, which in its translation to English is titled Souls on Fire, the book that we read. But here, then following Celebration biblical celebration, and then almost down at the bottom of the column, Celebration Talmudic, celebration of Talmud, and then on the top of the next column, celebration of prophetic writing, Celebration Prophétique. So here is the, again, the arch spokesperson for this most sober event that is in need of response at our time, who titles more books than any other group of books that he's read with the title Celebration. And celebration has connotations of what? What comes to mind with when you think of celebration? Just word, free association.
Joy.
Pardon?
Joy.
Joy, exactly. Yeah. I mean, we could go on with others. What's your name? I'm sorry.
Jeremy.
Jeremy what?
Singer.
Singer. Thank you, Jeremy. So joy is at the forefront. And indeed, his writing about Hasidism is, in fact, a thread of joy. It's much else, too. But there's a thread of joy in all of these studies. So this celebration, and if you look, I don't know which version of Souls on Fire you're reading, but the reprint in Jason Aronson includes a new foreword by Professor Wiesel that talks about this title of celebration and says it was titled this in French because Hasidism is a celebration of life. And this, I think, begins to move toward an answer that addresses the question of why veer from course when teaching about the Holocaust is at the forefront of the agenda. Meaning, teaching about the Holocaust, seemingly, he is implicitly communicating through the titles of these words, also has to have joined to it a teaching about the celebration of life. Because the celebration of life is that which ennobles the human being rather than, in fact, defaming the human being. And so that complement to teaching about what happened during this period of history where the human being, particularly the Jewish person and nation and religion was defamed, has to be a celebration to turn on its head what the enemy endeavored to do at that time. So I met with Professor Wiesel 10 days ago, and I asked him he had told me this about celebration and that there were going to be 7, and I wanted to just confirm that I had remembered that precisely, And he said, yes, indeed. And then he paused for me and said, still working on the others. So it's still in process there. Second, celebration of life with the coming to make the teaching about Hasidism, and then in our second session, God willing, on Wednesday morning on the Talmud, the integration of this facet into his project of teaching had to do with his own life's journey. You recall that he was born into a home in Transylvania, which was one of the centers of Hungarian Hasidism, and we'll talk more about that in a second, because his mother's side of the family stemmed from devoted Chasidim, devoted followers of the Wiesel Rebbe, and the master of Wiesnitz, a town in that area of Transylvania as well. And then following the war, Elie Wiesel, if you read his memoir, All Rivers Run to the Sea, for example, talked about how he endeavored to return to the traditional Jewish life that he had before the war. He was what's called a yeshiva bacher, where someone would sit in a yeshiva, a place of advanced Talmudic learning and study. And that's what he did in the aftermath of the war, albeit no longer in his hometown of Siget in Transylvania, but rather in the displaced person camps of France. And then he came under the tutelage of a teacher, a great teacher of his, referred to as Shoshani, who began to open up a broader secular horizon to him. And in the late 1940s and the 1950s then, he began to ponder many of the questions that we see he raises related to the Holocaust that culminate in his memoir, Night, which in Yiddish was called Und die Welt hat geschwiegen, and the world remained silent. From then on, for the next approximately 15 years, 14, 15 years, his writings are those that are dedicated to the Holocaust, whether in the novels, and you have the other bibliography, I think, before you, that gives the list chronologically: Night, Dawn, The Accident, Town Beyond the Wall, The Gates of the Forest, Jews of Silence, Legends of Our Time, A Beggar in Jerusalem, One Generation After, and the date is actually came out in 1971. It's published on April 11th, 1970. Why April 11th? Anyone? What's the connotation with April 11th? Besides the fact that it's my secular birthday, you probably don't know that, even though I'm sure Professor Anderson told you, so you'll invite me back and we'll have a celebration of its own kind. What? Celebrate? Oh, yes. So April 11th was the anniversary of the liberation of the Buchenwald concentration camp. Professor Wiesel made sure 1 generation after, 25 years after. It's the only book that he insisted be published exactly on that day, commemorating that anniversary. So up to that time, everything is centered front and center on the Holocaust. And then, as we see in 1972, Souls on Fire, celebration of Hasidism. So his own life course, his own biography, also is joined to that unfolding of bringing in traditional Jewish life and teachings as a factor of teaching about Holocaust and genocide. Because up until through the late 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, he was mainly living a solitary life. As a journalist, as a lecturer, as a writer. His family, as you remember from Night and other readings, his family, unfortunately, his parents and younger sister were murdered in Auschwitz. His two older sisters, thank God, did survive, and he did have regular contact with them. But the oppressiveness of living in the aftermath of that event, which turned the world upside down, clearly shaped him to outline a vocation in teaching about the Holocaust that was solitary. But then, in 1969, he met what is called his Besheret, his fated wife, Marion, and they married in 1969. And then a son was born to them in this very year, 1972, a son named Elisha. And so his personal life course took a turn to leaving behind the solitary as a fundamental orientation and becoming part of a family and part of a larger milieu of a family. He also, in that same year, very crucial to our sitting here in the Wiesel Center, accepted for the first time an invitation to become a university lecturer at the City University of New York. And before that, he had been tendered an invitation by no less an institution as Yale, but turned it down because it would confine him and it wouldn't allow that kind of vocation of teaching singly about the Holocaust through his writing, through his lecturing, solitary way all over the world. But here, these two events in the family and as a university teacher brought him into relation in such a way that that too becomes a complementary response to the Holocaust. Not only a celebration of life, but a celebration of the life collectively and with the other and with students and in the process of teaching itself becomes a response to the defamation of Jewish life that took place during the Holocaust. In that context, with life, really there's a corollary that is very important, which is the fact that in growing up in a Chasidic family, especially on his mother's side, his maternal grandfather, whose name was Rabbi Dodya Feig, became for him the preeminent teacher growing up, the preeminent mentor. And he was murdered also in Auschwitz during the Holocaust. And in the aftermath, his grandfather's mentoring came to be an overwhelming path for him. His grandfather was a superb storyteller and a devoted Chasid. So in the movement to making Hasidism part and parcel of his teaching about the Holocaust, it was integrating the life of Hasidim, of those who had lived during that time, whose life he was retrieving. And by telling his stories, we know from Souls on Fire with those interspersed italic sections, his grandfather's storytelling becomes the model and the paradigm for his own storytelling. And it also becomes a kind of a oasis from the searing specter of the Holocaust. Those of us who have studied the Holocaust or try to teach about it know that one has to be on guard, because what one sees during that time is so harsh and so anti-human that one can become, to use a medical metaphor, can become infected by it. And there are those, such as we're holding a symposium, God willing, in a few days, in tribute to the publication of a great book written on the Holocaust by Terence Dupre in 1975, who's not Jewish, but took on study of the Holocaust from the inside, lock, stock, and barrel. And it became so much of an obsession that it unfortunately drove him to commit suicide. So the dangers are real. And even for someone of the extraordinary, paramount strength, spiritual strength and fortitude of Professor Wiesel, that going to the study of this day in, day out, living it in his memory day in and day out, was overwhelming. So he says, when talking about the teaching of Hasidism, and I quote here, there with the study and writing about Hasidism, and he's talking particularly here about Chasidic celebration, Souls on Fire, there I feel no need to censor myself. I am less fearful of revealing what ought not to be revealed. There is no danger of blasphemy. I know what words need to be said. This is extraordinary. I know what words need to be said. I only have to repeat those I heard from my grandfather's lips. End of quote. So when he teaches about Hasidism, when he writes this book and the books that follow, Somewhere a Master for Hasidic masters and their struggle against melancholy, that he is becoming a vessel for his grandfather's teaching. And in that light, I asked if, with Professor Anderson, you could read the introduction to Legends of Our Time, which was published in 1968, so a few years just before, but he was already clearly moving in this direction, and we'll say more probably about this in discussion. But as you recall, that there's his meeting with the Wiesel Rebbe after the war, and he tries to explain what it means to be a secular writer and to deal with the events that he deals with. But at the end, he concludes by saying that, and now has come the time that Dod Yefag's grandson will take my place at the typewriter. So the integration of his grandfather's words as a lineage in its own right, as a way that what we heard in that first story, that Elie Wiesel is not only establishing his own lineage, but drawing upon that comes from the family and from one of the Chasidim, very special Chasid, who perished during the war. And that becomes he whose words he simply has to repeat. Fourth, Elie Wiesel has always seemingly thought of himself as a chassid. You read, I believe, the piece that he was written about his relationship with the Ungvar Rebbe, Rabbi Menashe Klein, that he was together with in Auschwitz. And Elie Wiesel, spoke of himself, as you see there, really as a chassid of three different masters. One, the Wiesel Rebbe, called the Avad Yisrael, the lover of Israel, who the meeting took place with at the beginning of Legends of Our Time, and who his grandfather was a devoted chassid of, so the family line comes there. Then second, he was a chassid, he became a chassid of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, of blessed Tzaddik Zatzal, of a righteous person of great blessing to his memory. And he fortunately escaped from the war by the skin of his teeth, coming to America from wartime France in 1941. But then in the aftermath of the war became a leader for hundreds of thousands of Hasidim, I think it's fair to say, some of whom dressed like Hasidim with long coats and had payas and wore special hats, but many of whom, like Professor Wiesel himself, were Hasidim, as it were, incognito. They didn't look at all like a chassid, they looked like a university professor. Kind of like Michael Grodin, yeah. The beard, Professor Wiesel's beard has never, I think, been quite so long, but so it was very crucial, his meeting with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, because the Lubavitcher Rebbe came from that world inside. He lost family members, and he could dialogue with Professor Wiesel. And the last section of Gates of the Forest, which I believe you've read, yes, is a fictionalized version of his being at the Verbringen, the celebration orchestrated by the Lubavitcher Rebbe in the 1960s, and the dialogue that took place that became so consequential in the writing of Gates of the Forest itself. Because, and Professor Wiesel records this in All Rivers Run to the Sea, it's also in his compendium Against Silence, that he clearly struggling, wrestling, protesting, which is how, actually a story in itself that we won't go into now, but that how he and the Lubavitcher Rebbe first were in contact, because the Lubavitcher Rebbe wrote him a letter that celebrated the protest that against God's silence that was there during the Holocaust, and the Lubavitcher Rebbe told him, you have to protest even louder, stronger, more intensely. It's not enough. And so he, with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, said to him, how can one believe after the Holocaust? Really a question that's so anchored when you see such devastation, such cruelty coming against such innocence and such holiness and such fine people. And even if they were just like myself or, run-of-the-mill people, undeserving of such carnage. So how can you believe that there's a God that takes care? So the Lubavitcher Rebbe said simply back to him, as Professor Wiesel records this, how can you not believe after the Holocaust? And to mine exactly what are the resonances there will take more time, that, again, maybe in the question and answer session, but it's saying something about the way that a chassid continues to persevere with protest and in spite of what took place to believe in God after the Holocaust. And then finally, the third Rebbe, the third master, who was extremely consequential that you saw in this article was the Ungvar Rebbe, Rabbi Menashe Klein, who was together with Professor Wiesel in Auschwitz and in Buchenwald, and was very close to it. Post-war France became close again when Professor Wiesel came to America in the late 1950s, and so close indeed that Professor Wiesel built in Jerusalem, in the community of the Ungvar Rebbe, a yeshiva, meaning a place of advanced Torah learning, in memory of Professor Wiesel's father, Shlomo ben Eliezer Zel. And you go there, I've been there, you go, there on the wall, dedicated by Eliezer Wiesel on behalf of his father, Shlomo ben Eliezer. And so the connections there were such that it was a childhood friend who had been through the same thing, but that had continued with the payas, with the long coat, with the learning of Talmud and sacred texts as the center point of existence, just like before the war, or even more. And this, for Professor Wiesel, was not only bracing, but it was a model. And it really, there's a beautiful essay in Against Science called, I believe called My Friend, where he writes of Rabbi Menashe Klein really as his alter ego. Meaning Professor Wiesel too could have been the head of a yeshiva, could have too been a Hasidic master. Finally, then the writing and the lectures, which we've been able to benefit by. In Souls on Fire, 4 Hasidic masters, somewhere a master. And then in the essays that appear in the 3rd section of Sages and Dreamers and of Wise Men and Their Tales. All of these then provide a glowing collection of the itinerary of the Hasidic movement. But it's not like a historian, as Professor Wiesel said. It's as a storyteller, someone from the inside who also focuses on the masters. In other words, what does it mean to be a virtuoso spiritual devotee who faces challenge day after day of having followers come and tell the worst things in their life and still be able to manifest unbending faith. But sometimes that faith is not unbending, as we see when Professor Wiesel develops his own interpretation, which focuses then on melancholy. So to conclude and then open the discussion, I think we've gone through then saying, what is the connection of the turn to Hasidism in Professor Wiesel's work that makes of it a mode of teaching about Holocaust and genocide. Celebration of life, which counters the defamation of life. Professor Wiesel's own biography, which went from a very tightly enclosed concentric circle to expand into connection with family, community, students, and enlarge that field of connection. The becoming a vessel for the voice of his grandfather. So one tells the story truly from inside. Fourth, the thinking of himself as a Chasid, And these three masters who, through each of their different imprints, allowed that Chasid to give expression to himself through his great métier of writing, and through that to be able to tell the story of the Chasidim. And that comes to the last point, because he says, for example, at the end of his essay on Rabbi Aron of Karlin, he says, we know that the Chasidim experienced likely the greatest losses of any group of Jews based in Eastern Europe, in Poland, in Russia, Ukraine, the Baltic countries, so that it's being able to be a voice on their behalf. And just finally, I think it also teaches that nothing is unaffected by the Holocaust. Even celebration must be connected to it. And so when he tells the story, for example, of the Katz Rebbe, which ends Souls on Fire, he says the Katz Rebbe went into solitude in 1839 for reasons unknown. And he goes through some of them and then says, I speculate that it might be because he had a prophetic vision of what would happen 100 years later. So there's no event, not only in the present and the future, but also in the past, that goes unaffected. And yet, it becomes the way to counter all of the intentions of the enemy to defame by being able to put at the center celebration. So thank you, and let's open the floor now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rosen, for being with us today. It's a real pleasure to hear you. I'd like folks to ask any questions that they might have. People at the table, you have a mic, but if there's someone here, I'm happy to pass the microphone. So I'm going to step out of the way myself here.
There's, of course, no wrong questions, right? And there can be comments there. Wherever you're coming from, whatever is in your mind with this, from your reading, it doesn't have to be dealing with what I've said.
Right. Please see this as an opportunity to ask any questions that you have about Chasidic life and practice, or any other works that Professor Wiesels that we've read. We just finished The Trial of God, which we puzzled over, remember? The ending in particular, what does this mean? What does he leave us with? So have at it.
Hi, again, thank you very much for speaking.
Who are you?
My name, excuse me. My name is Nick Boonstra.
What is?
Nicholas Boonstra.
Yes.
And my question is, as far as tragedies in the secular world, such as the attacks on September 11th, what role do you think celebration plays in responding to such tragedies as those?
Thanks. What a great question. I think that really Professor Wiesel is speaking to the Holocaust in particular, but also laying out a mandate for a response in general. It's true that as I was concluding to say, the Chasidim were particularly devastated in particularly cruel ways during the time of the Holocaust. So it's natural that he would turn there, and natural because of family connections and the other aspects. But I think that it's fair to say that celebration as a extolling of life, both the joy as that which can put us on guard against what the study and facing of such events can do, And we must have that, no doubt about it. To my mind, and I think that's Professor Wiesel's teaching. And also on a, we could say, an ethical dimension, as a way to be able to ennoble human being, all human beings, so that the reflection of God is seen palpably in every human being. And so that celebration means both joy, but it also means lifting human being up so that any kind of way of defaming into being non-human becomes an unimaginable task. Does that, yeah? Yeah? So it didn't deal with 9/11 precisely. I mean, we could talk more about that, but I thought more generally for now. Okay. Thank you, Nicholas.
So
One of the more seasoned students.
yes, always a student. So where does Elie's almost obsession with the notion of memory come in and play?
In this particular venue. Yeah, I think, first of all, as students, be interesting where your thoughts are going. I mean, my thoughts go to the beginning of Souls on Fire, and a story that he tells also in other venues, meaning with the Baal Shem Tov, who is the founder of the Chasidic movement, great charismatic leader of extraordinary, virtually unparalleled spiritual powers, who gets lost and has all of his powers taken from him. And eventually he and his assistant are freed because the assistant remembers the Aleph Beis, the alphabet, and begins to recite that. So I think that it's saying that even, or especially for Chasidim, this idea of remembering what is essential in terms of that which can be built on, and that which forms in according to Jewish mysticism, which forms the foundations of the universe and all that is, the Hebrew alphabet. That the memory of those kinds of foundations keep one in touch and in line with God's plan in the universe. And it's Hasidism that can teach us how to stay in touch with such memory of essential things from the beginning. That's one way.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great question.
More questions? I have a sort of a comment and question. One of the most memorable quotes for me of Wiesel's work, and I'm paraphrasing, is a comment that as long as we're talking to one another, it's much harder to hit each other. And I feel that this the role of dialogue and engagement, even if it's not all amiable and everyone's in agreement, that this is really so central to his work, that engaging in spite of everything is really an ethical command. And I wonder if you might say a few words about that concept, particularly with regard to his writing on Hasidut and the Talmud, the Bible.
The particularly dialogue, yes? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that the way that Professor Wiesel understands Hasidism is the relation between a master and a disciple. And it's not only his understanding, but that's a general understanding, but he is, I think, particularly sensitive to the fact that it is a movement and a spiritual vocation that cannot be defined except by two. There must be at least two there. The master by himself is fine. He has all sorts of powers, but he's not a Hasidic master. A Hasidic master needs, in order to be whom they are, a disciple that will bring questions, that will engage with them in the conversation that can lead to the building up of the disciple in all aspects of their lives, and that can also thus be the building up of the master who is, one can say, who is nurtured by that connection into being the master that they can be. So there's the story about the Professor Wiesel tells in Souls on Fire about the Vitebsker Rebbe, that there were some Hasidim who were from White Russia. And the Hasidic movement, as you remember, its beginnings were quite a distance from there, in Moldavia. And so some Hasidim came to Rabbi Dov Ber, the successor, who was the boy in the story we heard at the beginning, but as a grown man. And they said, listen, we come to you with all of our questions that we have, but in those days, in the 1770s, there was no internet, there was no telephone, believe it or not, and we can't go on with our lives just coming as we can so infrequently. We have questions abounding in our minds and in our hearts all the time. So what can we do? He says to them, you go back and you go to the town of Vitebsk. And in the town of Vitebsk, you'll look for someone named Menachem Mendel. And when you find him, he will be the one that will, when you can't come here, he'll be the one. He said, and here, when you go to see him, here, I'll give you my prayer belt, my girdle, said my coat, and my cane. Not as a cane for walking, but as a cane as a symbol of authority. So they go and they go back to this town, and they don't know such a person, and they ask around and they go through the whole town. No Menachem Mendel to be found, and they're at their wits' end. But they're discussing this, where are we going to find this Mendel? And all of a sudden this woman comes up and she says, I don't know, the Mendel that you're talking about, this great master, he's not around. I've never seen anyone, but I have a son-in-law, and he's by that name, so maybe that's the person you're thinking of. So she leads them back to the house and goes inside, and out comes this Jew, Menachem Mendel. And they see him. They hand over the prayer belt she puts on, and the coat she puts on, then the cane. And the story ends by saying, and there before their very eyes was a different person entirely. So it's the nature of Hasidism to see that interchange as fundamental.
Thank you very much. It's been a real honor. We'll look forward to seeing you again on Wednesday, and we'll
I
meet
look
here.
forward to it. Thank you all really for welcoming me in.